Hey y'all, this is the lecture on lesson objectives, and I'm just going to be explaining the parts of it, and then it will be your job to come up with relative pieces relevant to your sport and your lesson plan and your objective. Remember when we discussed in domains that the quality of the objective has to be inside of your lesson. So if you say that the learner will be able to do X, Y, and Z, then each X, Y, and Z has to appear in the body of your lesson. So don't list a bunch of things on top of the lesson plan unless they're going to actually be in the grid, in the content of the lesson. And we find this particularly, I find this particularly interesting, that most of the affective objectives will say the learners will be able to share, and the learners will be able to take turns, and the learners will be able to cooperate and give each other feedback. And then there is zero, literally zero mention of it in the lesson plan, which doesn't make any sense, because really objectives are what a student's going to learn as a result of your lesson. So you are teaching them these things. So we're going to go through what everything is, and here we go. The beauty of this, as always, is that you can stop it, go at any speed that you want. If I talk too fast, you can go back when I talk too fast. And so we're just going to proceed. Maybe we're not. So I guess I can't do presentation mode, but this will work. Maybe not. There we go. I guess I just won't be able to have slide things in, but that's fine. So as always, what I suggest is that you write things down, pause and write things down, and then I will assume that you've had these things written down and that you will then listen to the content, which is kind of the best of both worlds. So lesson objectives are really important. There's kind of a little funny saying that really actually is true. A program without objectives is like a car without a driver. So you can kind of think of, if you just have a program that's kind of a collection of things that really don't have objectives. What are the students going to learn as a result of your lesson at the end of the year? Then you really just have this like scattered, haphazard program that you really don't have a lot to show for, that there's really nothing measurable that you can say. You can go to a board or to a parent. If you wanted, why is my student getting a C? You could say, well, these are the objectives that I had, and these are the things that they did and didn't learn, and that's why they got a C. So objectives, the definition of them are, they are the purpose of the lesson, and they will what the students will learn as a result of your lesson. So extremely important that you have them, that they are good, and that they're aligned with the content in your lesson. And I will be looking for that specifically. In the criteria sheet that you're going to be given for the lesson plans that you will develop for this class, it will say, do the objectives include all of the parts, which we're going to talk about here momentarily, and do you find the content in the lesson plan? Super important. So why are they important? Number one, they're important for planning, organization, mapping, and creating a framework. And all of those words are things that we use frequently when we're talking about curriculum and we're talking about what we're going to do for a year. They're also called scope and sequence in the credential program. They'll call them scope and sequence, hopefully in the credential program that you choose. And then once you're in your departments, you'll sit down as a department and you will talk about kind of where you're going to go this year. Take a look at the standards, kind of put everything on the table, so to speak, and see who's going to do what and what is this going to look like? Where's the beginning and where's the end of your program? And how are you going to take pieces out of that and contribute to this big whole? Also, in physical education, this is kind of unique to us because you don't have to really spend a lot of time justifying the importance of math. Everybody understands that you've got to know math. Everybody understands the language arts importance. And really in physical education, for me, it's really hard to believe that I have to continually still, this many decades later, justify the importance of PE. But if you have a great PE program, you can bet that this will be the first great PE program that a lot of your students have ever seen. If you have amazing objectives, then it is easier for you to come to the table to talk about your great program. So if your program is on the chopping block, which will happen to every one of you in some way, shape, or form, if you, like I said, a student gets a C, you have to justify how great your program is to then justify why substandard performances warrant a C. And so it's important that these objectives are done well, because they really do a good job. I've actually had principals come to me and go, you have objectives in PE? And while I try to not have that mortified, offended face, it does help us in the long run if we do these things. These are this is an overview of the objectives. You don't have to pause this and write it right down, because write it down right now, because it will be in the next slides. You can I think you can see to the left right there, since I'm not in presentation mode, that it is coming. So don't worry about writing that down, because, for example, number 1 is behavior, 2 is condition, and the next slide is behavior. So there are 3 components of an objective, and the last one has 2 parts. So I'll refer to them as 4 different parts. You need 4 parts in every objective to be accurate. I think most people say that there are 3, and there are, but I've learned that if I say there are 4, you will then try to figure out what those 4 are and include them, because you're given points for all of those, and it's really important. When you go into any credential program, and if you learn how to write objectives like this, because they are objectives across the board. If you're doing math, if you're doing music, if you're doing objectives, need to have these parts. So part number 1 is what's called the behavior. So of course you can go ahead, and I strongly encourage you to pause this and write this all down, so I can just talk and you can just write and listen. So the behavior is what is expected of the student, what the student will do in your lesson. So for physical education, usually that's primarily, the bulk of the time, that is an active word. You're going to be throwing, catching, kicking, punting, skipping, galloping. The learner will be able to throw, and then the rest of the objective will be there. It's known as the action word or the verb. I know that sometimes when I throw out that it's the verb, it's not actually grammatically the verb. So if you're kind of the grammar police, you're going to have to get me a pass on this one, because it's not really of the verb, but it really is the action. So are they going to be throwing? Are they going to be catching? What is that piece of the standards, if you will, that you want your students to learn? You will see, these are just some notes, but you'll see on lesson plans, it'll say TSWBAT or TL. That just stands for the student will be able to, or the learner will be able to. And sometimes you will see TT, and that means that the teacher will be able to. And it's just because we write that so many times that sometimes people just write that out, but we tend to just leave it like that. We write it so many times that it becomes initials. Okay, the next part of your objective is the most frequently forgotten, one of the most frequently forgotten. It's called the condition. And there's not one of the condition, situation, setting, or environment. Anything that helps your mind get around the fact that in your condition, in your objective, you need to have a condition somewhere. It's really kind of the setting that your students are performing the skill in. And it's really important when you're out there in the real world. Right now, it might be something that you're just like, the importance of this doesn't make too much sense to me. But when you're planning, and you're planning a lesson that, say you do a lesson and it's way too easy for your students, or it's way too hard for your students, you can go into the condition and change it and make it more complex. But if you don't have that in there, you can't really use it as a guide to make your lesson plans more difficult, to make your activities more difficult, to make your expectations more difficult. So it's really the setting, the environment that your skill is being performed in. So if you have throwing and catching from 10 feet away, that's your condition. It's much different than throwing and catching in a live game. And you can see kind of where those two would begin. One is a more closed skill. One is a more open skill. One is at the beginning of your curriculum, or at least the lesson plan. One is more towards the end. And so the condition really helps you determine the complexity of your objective. So back and forth between cones during a game of 4 corners or a 4 corners activity, whatever you expect that skill or that behavior to be performed in, that's going to be your condition. So in a cognitive objective, when you say the learner will be able to recite the cues to a partner, would be the condition. To the teacher is a condition. That's the environment that that skill or behavior is occurring. on a test, those types of things are the condition. So the next piece is what are called the criteria, and there are two parts to it. So it's kind of part 3 and part 4. So again, pause this, write this all down. The criteria is the number or the thing that has to be met in order for this objective to have been achieved. So it's the criteria to meet or the performance level expected, and it indicates when success is achieved. So it's, you know, plain and simple, it's kind of the numbers and the words that go with what you're expecting. So if you're expecting someone to throw, or let's do shoot a basket because that's an easy observable thing. You're shooting free throws and you expect them to make 5 out of 10. The 5 out of the 10 is the piece that you're expecting them to achieve. And if that's really something that you're basing future lesson plans on and it's really important for you, you strive to get as many students to fit to that 5 out of 10 as you possibly can. And then of course you're going to say 5 out of 10 from the free throw line, or if you have a modified lesson where people can move that free throw line elsewhere, you'll see that in developing the content later. You can say from their free throw line. So that numbers piece is important. It's usually a 5 out of 10, you know, a 7 out of 10 if it's an easier task. If it's a timed thing, maybe you want them to do it in 30 seconds. Maybe you want them to do it 10 times consecutively. There's a number in all of those things. Continuously for 30 seconds. So anything that has a number in there, that has to be in your lesson plan. It has to be observable, and numbers make it observable. You can, you know, certainly you can't stand back and watch and make sure that your entire class is doing 7 out of 10, but they can. You could videotape it and go back and watch. You can say, my goal for you today is I want you to make 5 out of 10 in this basket or this target or this hoop. And then you can say how many people did. And typically, you'll know the kids who aren't honest, but typically kids are pretty honest. So if you're thinking about the next piece of what makes a skill, a quality movement, or an objective a quality objective, is this qualitative part. So the first criteria is that it has to be numbers. So they're 5 out of 10, whatever that is. The second criteria that has to be in every objective is the qualitative pieces. So you're measuring with words and you're measuring with numbers. If you say that you want someone to shoot a free throw, I wish I was in real life, I could show you an example, but I'll do my best to show it on this little tiny thumbnail. So if you say that you're shooting free throws, we'll do free throws, and if your goal is 5 out of 10, but yet they're shooting like this, or they're shooting with their elbow out and their hand on top, or something really funky, you don't want them to do that. The quality, thus qualitative, the quality of the movement must be there as well. It's as important as the number. And now in basketball, we don't really care if it goes in, it goes in. I mean, a crazy layup where you're trying to move around people and it goes in is still worth 2 points. But as you're teaching people to be quality movers so that they are able to adapt in a live game, it needs to, you know, the whole beat where everything's in alignment and they follow through and they do, get to my hand, but you know, follow through and they do the reach for the cookie in the jar, snap thrust, whatever it is. Those are the words that describe it. So all of that has to be part of your objective. The behavior, the condition, where it's going to occur, the number of times you're expecting it, and the quality of that movement, which we call skill cues. So right here, again, you can pause it and write this down. But your objectives, you can see that this one is the student will be able to perform a volleyball forearm bump pass to a frontline player from the back line from a toss ball over the net. That whole thing is a condition to the frontline player from the back line. They're tossing a ball and you want it to go over the net. Those are all the condition. You can see it down here actually. So it says behavior, there's the condition. The criteria is you want them to do it 7 out of 10 times. That's the criteria with numbers. And then the criteria with words is you're really going to focus them on a flat platform. You'll have to show it so you know what it looks like. Passing down the midline of your body, and you'll show that this means the midline and this doesn't. And then you don't want them to bend their arms. So keep their arms straight. And that's the objective for my lesson. If people don't do it 7 out of 10 times, I haven't achieved this objective. If they bend their arms, which a lot of them do when they first learn, to swing them, or they'll bend them, or they'll run around like this and then instantly put them out, then you've got to work on that a little bit more. And that's really what objectives are. They are kind of frameworks for success or not. so that you can figure out if you can move on or not. So if this is a abysmal lesson and you get nobody can do it, or they do it 3 out of 10 times, which is typically the case because the bumping is really hard, then you know that you can't move on to something more complex or more difficult. So I'm going to go through some of these. This is one for dance. Students will be able to accurately perform 2 grapevines in succession to the right and left. And there's the step behind step touch. Those are the cues for the skill. Alone and with a partner to the rhythm of music 2 times in a row without making a mistake. So there are the pieces of that. If you want to write those down. This lecture is also on Canvas, so you can print it off or take a look at it in that manner, because you may not want to write all this down right now, because I think there's a lot of them, but they're here to help you. Here's a cognitive one. Recite the cues for skipping, which is an alternating step, hop, step, hop in an uneven rhythm to a partner, because you're reciting the cues. So who, to a partner, to a teacher, you're going to write them down, whatever it is. 1 time during closure without any errors. So if you take a look at the criteria on this one, the condition is to a partner during closure. The behavior is obviously recite cues for skipping. And then the criteria is with words, step hop in uneven pattern. And then 1 time without any errors is that criteria for achievement, that number, how many times do you want them to do that? They're going to recite it 1 time without any errors. Here's one for throwing that you can pause and write down or look at on Canvas. Here is a really good one for catching. While on the move, they're going to catch a ball thrown from a stationary partner. I want you at least 20 feet away. You're going to reach out and meet the ball with a W with your thumbs if it's above waist, or an M if it's below the waist, with the pinkies together. And then I want you to absorb the force 6 out of 10 times. So all of that is in there. You can see that the condition is a ball that's thrown from partner. Partner's going to stand still, and they're going to throw it to you from at least 20 feet away. And then I'm looking for 2 things. I want you to catch it 6 out of 10 times, and I want you to use the cues. Reach for the ball, use the appropriate W or M, and I want you to absorb the force. Those are the things I'm looking for, the things we're going to talk about, the things we're going to talk about in the introduction, during the activity, and the closure. That's the meat of my lesson. And here's the last kind of piece. So even, if you're teaching throwing and catching, each of those skills needs to have its own objective. So you can tell, because each of them need kind of their own cues. They need their own space. If you're throwing stationary to a moving partner, those are certainly different. The throwing will occur stationary. You've got to do your cues for throwing and how many times you want that thrower to be successful. The catching is a separate skill. It has its own cues. There's some movement going on with that. There's probably some things with some lead passes. Whatever it is, it has its own cues. It needs its own objective. So you can't say the learner will be able to throw and catch unless you're working on game stage 2, and we'll talk about that. And it's very important that you understand the difference. But typically you'll say the student will be able to throw, and then you give the criteria for and the condition for throwing. Then you'll say the learner will be able to, in a completely and total separate objective, the learner will be able to catch. And here's the condition for catching, and here are the criteria with numbers and words. Each objective will need to be its own sentence, not several sentences. So 1 objective, 1 sentence. It's a little bit of a run-on sentence. If it gets too long, you may want to look at how you can abbreviate it, but you can tell just from 1 sentence up, that's a pretty long objective, but it is 1 sentence and it has just the 4 pieces. So 1 sentence, 1 objective, 1 skill. And there'll be points affiliated with your ability to understand that. 1 skill, 1 sentence, 1 objective. And then lastly, mentioned lots of times, and I can tell you that a good percentage of people who do the affective objective, is really hard to teach this. Affective objective is a skill just like throwing. So if you're going to teach them how to exhibit appropriate losing behaviors, then you've got it just like a skill. If I'm going to teach you how to throw, we're going to talk about it in the introduction. We're going to work on it in the lesson. I'm going to give you opportunities to practice it, give you feedback, give you time to learn from your mistakes, and then we're going to talk about it in closure. The same thing with an affective objective. If I'm going to teach it, I'm going to talk about it in the introduction or somewhere in the lesson, give you opportunities to practice and work on it, maybe give you some feedback, hopefully give you some feedback. and then talk about it in the closure. So what this last bullet says is, if you list it as a behavior or expectation in your objectives, you must include it somewhere in the content. So if you want them to cooperate, you have to devote time to them doing this concept. So I think that's it for lesson objectives. Not too bad. Let me know if you have any questions, as always, and keep this on the surface, and also get the lesson plan notes out so you can do well on the quiz, midterm, and lesson plan. Bye. Bye.